What is VAWA? The Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, is a law that was enacted in 2013 that protects tenants from being denied assistance or terminated from federally assisted housing on the basis of, or as a direct result of, being victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. The applicant or tenant must otherwise qualify for admission, assistance, participation, or occupancy. Housing providers covered by VAWA. VAWA covers the following housing providers: public housing, Section 8 housing choice vouchers, Section 8 project-based housing, Section 202 housing for elderly, Section 811 housing for the disabled, Section 236 multifamily rental housing, Section 221, subsection D, subsection 3, below market interest rate, or BMIR, housing opportunities for people with AIDS, or HOPWA, Continuum of Care and Emergency Solutions Grants Programs, Housing Trust Fund, Rural Development Multifamily Housing, and finally, Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or LITC. VAWA does not cover private housing providers that do not receive federal assistance. However, there may be local ordinances that provide protection. If you are the victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, or stalking, and your housing provider receives federal funds, you have the following rights. You cannot be denied admission to a federally funded housing provider. You cannot be denied federal rental assistance. You cannot lose your federal rental assistance or subsidy. And finally, you cannot be evicted simply because you have been threatened or are the victim of domestic violence or stalking. Caution: VAWA cannot always prevent eviction. There are circumstances where you can fall under the act and be evicted. If you are served with an eviction notice, you should contact your local legal aid immediately. Your housing provider or landlord is required to tell you about VAWA's housing protections when you receive assistance, upon move-in, at recertification, if you are denied admission or assistance, if your assistance is terminated, or you receive an eviction notice. This form is Form HUD-5380. Your housing authority or landlord must keep your information confidential unless disclosure is required to evict the abuser, disclosure is required by law, or disclosure is with your permission. Frequently asked questions. Do I have to ask for VAWA protection? Yes. While your request may be verbal, it is always best to do so in writing. You may submit a signed letter, or you may use the form given to you by your housing provider. What if I live with my abuser? If someone you live with has used violence against you, your housing provider may evict your abuser alone. A change in family size, however, may require you to move into a unit of appropriate size. What if I am not head of household or it is not my subsidy? You should generally have 90 days, that's 90, or until the end of the lease to establish eligibility for the housing or subsidy. You may also request an emergency transfer if you believe you are in danger of more abuse or you have been the victim of sexual assault within 90 days of the request. Your housing provider must have an emergency transfer plan. Do I have to prove that I am eligible for VAWA protection? Your housing provider may request documentation that you are a victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and/or stalking. The request for documentation from your housing provider must be in writing. You can submit one of the following: a form developed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is Form HUD 5382. Or you may provide a letter from a third party who is providing assistance with the situation. Or you may provide a police report or court order or other record that reflects the incident. Your housing provider may not request more than one of these three options. And once that information is provided, the housing provider can only request additional information if the abuser claims to be the victim. Along with VAWA, the Federal Fair Housing Act offers additional protections based on a person's sex or gender. These protections are extended to any housing provider that falls under the Federal Fair Housing Act. Sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination prohibited by the Fair Housing Act. Sexual harassment comes in many forms, and it disproportionately affects women. However, it is not limited to women. The Act lists two categories of sexual harassment. Those categories include, but are in no way limited to: 1. Requiring a person to submit to an unwelcome request to engage in sexual conduct as a condition of obtaining or maintaining housing or housing-related services. And 2, subjecting a person to severe and pervasive unwelcome sexual conduct that interferes with the sale, rental, availability, or terms and conditions and privileges of housing or housing-related services, including financing. Reasonable accommodations. VAWA protections are limited to tenants. However, under the Fair Housing Act, you can make a request of your housing provider to make an exception to their rules, regulations, and requirements. This request, known as a reasonable accommodation, allows the tenant to request VAWA protections if a live-in aide is a victim and may request an emergency transfer for the household. Familial status. A housing provider may not discriminate against tenants or prospective tenants based on a family member's sex, pregnancy, or minor children in the household. A housing provider cannot refuse to rent to families with children, except registered senior housing, require families with children to occupy a certain floor, enact rules that are aimed at children, with minor exceptions for health and safety. Additional considerations. Establish a safety plan. Obtain an order of protection and give a copy to your local police department. Once obtained, inform neighbors and landlords that the abuser is no longer allowed to be in your home. This may be a difficult step, but it is necessary to protect yourself and your family. Keep IDs, birth certificates, and other important documents in a safe place. For additional support, please contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233.